So as RT indicated, Alex is having some technical difficulties, which in fact is a third-party risk management problem, right? In this case, the platform is the third party, the browser is the third party, and we're running into some resilience and some operational things. When Alex does get on stage, he's going to talk a lot about sort of what is going on that's driving a lot of these things, and we're gonna sort of do this a little bit backward, because I'm going to talk about how to improve your program. But what I will say up front is I've been involved in cybersecurity since it was called information security years and years and years ago. And I honestly believe at this point that third-party risk management, supply chain risk management, vendor risk management may very well be the most difficult problem we have ever faced as security leaders. Why is that? Because we have tens, hundreds, thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of partners who influence our ability to deliver on our goals and objectives at some level. We actually just brought on a new customer at Black Kite. I won't tell you who, but they're monitoring 100,000 vendors in their ecosystem that they deem to be important to be able to deliver. It looks like Alex is here. Alex, say hi. All right, perfect. So I just did a quick background, Alex. I'm going to hand it over to you actually to run through your stuff, because I think that's the normal flow, and I'll jump in as I see fit, and then we'll kind of close out and we'll take questions as we go. So Alex, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Oh, good. Yeah, so we had a third-party risk issue this morning. Still not sure exactly what it was. My apologies for it. I think part of what happens, kind of a resilience thing, right? Anybody in this industry tends to use a lot of different platforms. And for whatever reason, this one didn't like the settings that were left over from others. So it is what it is. But let's move forward. So again, Jeffrey introduced himself. I'm Alex Sharpe. Sharpe like a knife. That's usually the way I tell people to remember my name. They both have E's on the end. I've been in this business for a very long time. I started just like Jeffrey when it was called information security, InfoSec, and that term was actually being debated, right? It was brand spanking new. I don't want to tell you how long I've been doing this, but I guess it's longer than some of the attendees have been around. So it is what it is. So why don't we go on to the next slide, and we'll start going through this. I will set the foundation and kind of tee it up, so when going through and laying the foundation, Jeffrey can come in and kind of hit it home. So what's on the docket? I'm not a big fan of reading slides, but you get the idea, right? The idea is increasing visibility, increasing collaboration. That's a big one, because as the world is evolving, which we'll talk about in a minute, the cyber used to be thought of as a technology problem handled by technologists, right? And now it's a business conversation. So there's a lot of business aspects around it, and a lot more than just technology. We'll talk about some emerging trends, and then tools and techniques. A lot of the tools and techniques are in Jeffrey's part of it, but you get the idea. So let's go to the next slide. There we go. So if you look at what's happened, the security models that we have been dealing with don't match the way we work and live today. So a lot of the security paradigms we still work with were designed with a castle and moat strategy in mind, where we could collect all of our assets into one place. We put them in a room. We threw these strange technical people in there. We pushed some pizza under the door every once in a while, and they kind of took care of it for us. And it relied very heavily, whether we recognize it or not, it relied very heavily on a physical perimeter and a dedicated network we can control, right? We knew what assets we had. We knew who was let into the building. There was guards and access controls, and depending on the facility, sometimes it was barbed wire and dogs and sensors and all kinds of cool stuff. But we also knew where the gazintas and the gazaltas were, what was connecting to who and when. And we had a small percentage of people that would work remotely, and they would mostly connect through this thing called a DMZ that most people will go, okay, conceptually I get the idea, but I don't really know what it is. So next slide. All right, that's not the world we live in. The world we live in, those hard walls in that castle and moat are more porous than ever. The technology is not only woven into the fabric of everything we do, but it's also expanded in ways that we can't collect it in one place. So if you can look at the slide, and unfortunately, this may not be as big as it was, but we've gone from just IT assets to having everything. We have IoT, right? Devices up the wazoo. We have building systems included. We have this new funny thing called AI, which involves data scientists who we've never had to deal with before. But also most knowledge workers, right? The people that rely on applications and data are now outside of that guarded perimeter, right? So we have more assets and applications outside of those walls than we've ever had before. And this is just a little point. In fact, nobody thinks about it. This is why we have the rise of multi-factor authentication, because we used to rely on having people come to work every day, log on to the network, go past all the guards, do the access controls, and then we had to have another level of assurance to get them to, help us understand, are they really where they are? Anybody who's interested and have been around for a while, these are called factors because there's three classes of factors. Who you are, what you know, and what you have. So what you know is like a password. Who you are would be biometrics like your thumbprint or eye or something else. And then, anybody who's used like a YubiKey or a secure ID, that's a token that you'd have, or even the MFA on your phone, right? So we have this massive misalignment between our security architectures and our today's reality. And if we look, most of what we're dealing with today is third parties. Next slide, please. There we go. So to drive this home a little, about 2 years ago, the World Economic Forum put out this study that said 60% of global revenue is by digital. That number is clearly higher now, right? It's clearly higher. But what does this mean? It's made it a business imperative, right? And cyber is important because the moment organizations go digital, they step onto the cyber battlefield. And if you look at the previous slide, most of what's important to our assets, our data, our capital, our human capital is actually outside of our perimeter. They either have become or they use third parties extensively, like the cloud, IaaS, SaaS. You can go through the whole list. Next slide, please. And by the way, as we go digital, we're seeing actually a decrease in greenhouse gases. Keep on going. The downside is, while it's coming down, going digital, other things are going up. So it is whatever. The other side, right? So we have the cash flow, which is revenue, and then we have the balance sheet valuations are also being driven by digital. More than half the assets, this is a big number, more than half the assets that are driving corporate valuations, like stock prices, are now intangible. Intellectual property, people, software, data. These are the reasons why cyber has become so important. And again, a lot of it is being entrusted to these outside third parties. Next, please. And this is one of my favorites, right? This slide, believe it or not, is now 7 years old, right? Pre-pandemic. Certain sectors, predominantly finance, had basically realized, for a number of reasons, including regulators coming down on them pretty hard, saying, you know what, cyber is important to our business. We are now on that digital battlefield. We have to protect ourselves. So Cyber, why don't you leave the kids table and come join the adults? And now we're starting to see that with COVID ripple through all other sectors. So with COVID, if anybody's interested, you could study things like Moore's Law and Joseph Schumpeter's work on innovation. But we know that these disruptions cause an adoption. So every sector experienced somewhere between 5 and 10 years of digital adoption within about 6 weeks. The biggest number I saw was actually telemedicine and telehealth, which actually achieved 11 years worth of growth in 6 weeks. These are staggering numbers, but this is why third-party risk is so important, because we are trusting our most valuable assets, including our customers and people, to third parties. Next slide, please. This is how it's realizing itself. Historically, we have focused very heavily on technical controls, right? I like to joke that we have taken our technical controls, pointed towards the adversary and said, hit me here. The adversaries have figured it out, right? So what are they doing? They're attacking the other dimensions, right? We've seen that rise in social engineering, and I've got a couple statistics here, right? We got big rises in that. We also know that they are increasingly finding ways to perform malicious activities without being detected, so they can actually reap the rewards for many, many months, long before we even know they're there. Solar winds, we know the bad guys were inside of solar winds for about a year. They actually had written their code, did their stuff, ran some tests, did all this, and were running it for months before we ever knew it was there. And we actually detected that totally by accident. Totally by accident. So what's really going on here is, as we move from the basic phases of protect, detect, recover. By the way, anybody looking at the slide should realize that those 5 chevrons in the govern function are the new CSF2. But as we move from left to right, what we know is technology is taking a smaller role. People, process, and the organization is taking a larger role. We are also moving in a world where we recognize, because of this vast amount of exposure, that we can no longer prevent everything. We have to realize that incidents are going to happen. And when we're dealing with third parties, it's much more complicated because we don't own them, right? We can't tell them what to do. And they have other customers other than us. Next slide, please. All right. As small and medium-sized businesses are hit the hardest, right? Anybody in that space will tell you this is true. It turns out this number is here around 61. I've seen other studies that are higher, but conservatively, that means 3 out of 5 small businesses are going to get hit by a cyber incident that they're aware of. We believe that many more are actually being exploited and have not yet detected, because the detection level.
Yeah. Alex, let me just add something. Let me just add something here. Sure. From our research. We actually we did a ransomware study last year, and we found that the most targeted organizations are between $10 and $100 million in revenue. Not the huge companies. It's that mid-range, and they're the ones that are being victimized. So I think that sort of supports what you're putting out here.
Yeah, it does. What we've seen is, now that the larger organizations are prepared and know how to defend, what we're seeing is their ransomware folks are moving downstream to the ones that are less protected. And the thing about the ransomware folks is, we have to remember that they are rational economic actors, right? They're looking to get paid. So they're going to find somebody who's going to pay them. So an SMB, that usually is their only source of income. It's not like they have a W-2 that they're going to go find another job. They own the business, so they're more likely to pay, even though a lower number, just to keep their livelihood alive. Thank you for adding that. It's also about 2 out of 5 are coming from the supply chain. That number is going to increase. And we also know that SMBs are more likely to get hit by social engineering attacks. So let's go to the next slide. There you go. So we were talking before about being hit by third parties. This is the Verizon report that's about a year old, right? They haven't released the new one yet. When they wrote that one, this was a year ago. Again, about 3 out of 5 breaches actually comes from a third party. We believe that number is going up. Click, please. There we go. And we also, oh, back one. There we go. We're talking about the human element. About 4 out of 5 data breaches are through social engineering attacks. That's important because the adversaries have realized that the technical defenses are strongest. So they are moving to the weakest, most vulnerable. And why do they go after social engineering attacks? Because they work. And there's also a huge amount of attack surfaces in any organization. If you have 100,000 employees, you have 100,000 potential entry points. Every person. And if you're interconnected, you can go after one person in an MSP and actually penetrate 10, 15, 20, 100 different organizations, right? This is why the stuff becomes so important and so critical, right? Third-party risk management is by definition much harder because we are actually delegating responsibility to an activity to somebody. We can't delegate the accountability, right? So we still own it. But anytime we try to work an issue, incident response, ransomware, forensic investigation, pulling log files, anything you want to do, it's no longer going to your folks and saying, do this for me. You have to reach out to a third party that has competing priorities, competing interests. And if it's not included in your agreement, it's probably not going to happen. All right, next slide. All right. The other part is we now talk about a difference of reliance. So when you're dealing with a third party, let's use like a cloud service provider, right? Or an IaaS provider. They're going to hand you, the better ones are going to have a report, usually a SOC 2 type 2, that lists the security services that they provide, but they're also going to have a list of things that are your responsibility, or at the very least, things you need to, that they don't do, right? You need to implement compensating controls. Most people have never dealt with compensating controls. By the way, the largest data breaches, the cloud-related data breaches, every one of them involves a missing compensating control, and they also involve a misconfiguration. The most famous is Capital One because it's the most advertised. There was a whole thing about, well, I thought you were configuring the firewall. No, you configured the firewall. Nobody configured the firewall. So that's how they were breached. Service level agreements are incredibly important. If your upstream providers, your clients, regulators, whomever you're a part of, tell you you can only be offline for 4 hours, guess what? If one of the third parties is offline for 6, you've blown through your number, and you're going to be held accountable, not the third party. So those need to be included in there, right? Put SLAs in, but also have penalties to cover your costs. Not only the penalties, but your recovery costs, right? And we all know the golden rule. He with the gold rules. If you're the upstream provider, you've got a lot of latitude because people want your business. But the best time to do it is when you're negotiating the contract, not trying to retrofit later. Agreements are, again, a non-technical control that are incredibly important when you're dealing in the world we live in today. Next, please. There we go. 3 primary concerns, right? We've all heard about CIA, confidentiality, integrity, availability. It remains the same. But when we run into third party, we need to remember that it's the same issues, the same perspective, the same risks that are all highlighted and influenced in a slightly different way. Availability, right? You can have the most redundant systems on premise. You can have all this stuff, backups. You could have people in waiting, but guess what? If your services require support from a third party like an MSP and they go out, everything you've done is for naught, right? You have to look at what they're doing and what assurances they have in place. The attack vector, again, like we talked about a minute ago, these folks tend to be the point of being penetrated. We talked a minute ago about how building systems are now part of modern IT. Target had one of the largest data breaches reported so far because somebody who managed their heating and ventilation system was compromised. Whoever thought they'd be compromised through an HVAC vendor? Here's a better one. One of the casinos was compromised by the people that remotely managed their aquariums. Whoever thought about that? I worked a company that was actually hit 3 times by ransomware in 18 months. And it was all the cause of a concrete vendor. Who would ever think that they would have an incredibly painful set of breaches because of a concrete vendor, right? And unless you look at it, it's there. But it's these attack vectors we never would have thought of before. And then with all of these organizations, or I should say most of the third parties, right? Like we talked about what knowledge workers, the data, the applications are now living outside the firewall. We've entrusted people with our most important assets that our customers, our partners, our regulators, the legislatures are requiring us to protect. And now we've given it over to somebody else. That's out of our control, out of our direct control. All right, next, please. And then we'll turn it over to Jeff. I think I'm almost there. So the requirements for this: third parties, external organizations like your regulators, contracts with your partners and customers. They'll tell you what you're required to do. And then the one that's often forgotten is internal operations. You need to protect your crown jewels, the stuff that makes you unique and what you are required to operate. I can guarantee you if you protect everything, but your folks don't receive a paycheck, they're not going to be happy, right? And those things are often forgotten. Next, please. Next. Oh, we're there, sorry. And then the business impact assessment. I'm sorry. Yeah, the business impact assessment is something that every organization should have. Most of them already do. The reality is most people on the technology side have never heard of it. This is actually a document that's written from the business perspective of what the priorities are, what business operations are more important than others, what the service levels are, what level they're operating at, what kind of outages, how much data can be lost without being too painful, and also who owns them. This is the best thing you can look for when looking at your third-party risk management program because it sets out your priorities. Next, and it should be the last slide. There you go. Jeffrey, it's all yours.
All right. Thanks, Alex. And again, thanks everyone being here. That was a great sort of table setting, Alex. And there's just 2 things I just want to kind of jump. One, you talked about the concept of partners, which is that cascading risk problem. And we've started to see awareness of that become really, really critical because I may choose to do business with you, but I don't choose to do business with who you do business with. But if they fail, I struggle. And I actually have a couple of examples in here. And the other one, the sources of requirements, you talked about internal operations. We've seen a huge uptick in Security Operations Center, SOCs, looking for external third-party data to bring in. Not everyone, but most people feel comfortable about protecting their own stuff, but they don't necessarily feel comfortable about protecting or about what's going on the other side. And you talked about something earlier. Unless you are a huge company, you can't go to Google and tell them, hey, you know what? You guys are not patching fast enough for me. You can't go to Microsoft and say, hey, you don't have MFA where you should. So in many cases, we don't actually have any leverage. And sometimes all we can do is be aware of the dependencies. And I think it's particularly interesting today because, as everyone may or may not be aware, AT&T Mobile is currently going through a global, national outage in the U.S., right? They are a huge third party, and you can't do business in many cases if you don't have cell phone service. So just an interesting one that just popped up. So, okay, RT, can you hit the next slide for me, please? So here are just some examples, and I actually, we have a company kickoff next week, and I've just updated these. So a couple of these I just want to hit on quickly. So two of them in particular, we see Log4j and MoveIt. So one of the attendees actually asked a question about supply chain software risk. That is a huge problem. These are two softwares that we may use or we may not, but if our partners use them, we are exposed. So we have to have visibility in there. If you look here, this company, Sirva and BGRS, they are companies that maintain and monitor move data for relocation for, among others, the Canadian national government. Somebody breached their systems. If I am a national actor, if I'm a state actor, I would love to know who in the Canadian federal government just moved, because I know that role's changed and maybe the people aren't ramped up. We look at DP World, ION UK, and the Port of Nagoya. These are organizations that are part of digital and physical supply chain. All three of them got hit with attacks/ransomware in the last year. And I guarantee you, no manufacturing company realizes that 90% of their product is flowing through the Port of Nagoya. 90% of the people who are using ports in Australia don't know that DP World systems caused 0 containers to be unloaded for 5 days over the weekend, a month before Christmas, right? These are the kinds of things that we need to start thinking about. And most people are just not. Most people are struggling with their own internal things. Next slide, please, Archie. So old school third-party risk management was very, very simple. If legal was okay with the contract and finance said, yes, we believe this company will be in business for the length of the contract, we signed, but no more. Next slide, please. Now we have all of these different risks that need to be looked at, right? So there's cyber risk, there's data, there's, Alex talked about resilience and business continuity, and we're going to share the slides out, so I'm not going to read through this, but I think understanding that we have all of these different new risks in here, ESG is starting to come up, sustainability, all of these things are being looked at. And the challenge in third-party risk management is they're all coming from different sources. They resonate with different stakeholders. And as I said at the very beginning, I believe, and I've been around for 30 plus years, I think third-party risk management is the most difficult problem we have ever faced. And I don't think it's getting any easier. Next slide, please. So how do you build one of these things from the ground up? Now, keep in mind, even if you have something, you can still use these tips, because I think even if you have something, you can always grow and improve it. So next slide, please. So 5 phases here, and I know the color scheme is not optimal. Alex talked about the 5 phases of NIST. These are very much aligned with those. So identify, what do we got? Assess, how bad is it? Analyze, what can we do about it? Treat, how do we behave, right? So do we offset? Do we buy insurance? Do we actually deploy controls? Do we make people do other controls? Or in real extreme cases, do we sever a business relationship? This is actually becoming something that we are starting to see, which 5 years ago, nobody ever would have anticipated that we could do that. And then ongoing monitor, right? So most of you are probably much younger than Alex and I. So you may not remember, there was an old shampoo commercial, which was lather, rinse, and repeat, right? So rinse and repeat. This is a cycle that we need to keep going through, because it's not one and done. This is something that's always changing. And historical third-party risk management has been very much point-in-time snapshot. Here, fill out this questionnaire. We're going to look at it or not. We're going to file it or not. We're going to do something about it or not. But a year, 2 years, 3 years down the road, we don't know what you have going on. And even assuming the questionnaires are accurate and truthful at day 1, day 90, day 180, day 365, you have inertia. These things change. The environment changes. The technology environment changes. The threat environment changes. So monitoring brings this whole thing together in a cycle. Next slide, please. And make sure you keep the questions coming while we're doing this. So actually, you can skip right past this one. So and actually, you know what, RT, build this out because this has a little animation in here. So one of the things people struggle with is how they can prioritize their third parties. And I always suggest, if you have not done it, and Alex mentioned the business impact analysis, which is a great way of doing that. But I always tell people, look at two criteria. How bad would it be for your operations if a particular partner fell over, right? Would it cause you to have a problem for a day, a week, or longer? And then the second thing is, if you're sharing data with them, how bad would it be if they got breached and your data got lost? So what I always encourage people to do is focus on that sort of outward right. And then as you start to get better, you can then move back in. I always talk to people, I use this as a sort of an analogy. How many of you feel comfortable that you could patch 50,000 servers? And if you say yes, you're deluding yourself. But I bet if I said, can you patch 100? You'd say, sure, we can do that. So let's patch 100. Let's figure out how that process works. And then let's go to 500 and then 1,000 and then 2,000. And eventually you have a process that scales to a larger thing. Many people only are doing third-party risk management on their key partners. But if you do that really well, you can then start expanding out. And one of the things we're seeing, and Alex talked about regulation, so the new SEC requirements for publicly traded companies in the US and their customers, DORA out of the EU, a lot of local regulations are asking questions about third parties, but part of the question they're asking about third parties is, what are they doing about their third parties? So we now have this nth party ecosystem that most people don't even have visibility into, let alone have the ability to actually manage risk. So next slide, please.
Hey, Jeffrey, let me jump into that a second. You mentioned the SEC.
Yeah, of course, Alex.
So the SEC so far has only issued the first rule, which is really about reporting, annual reporting and incident reporting for publicly traded companies. The second rule that's in flight is for all market participants, whether you're privately held, publicly traded, whatever. If you are involved, if you're within the scope of the SEC or you support one of the SEC, entities, you're within scope. And DORA is actually a broader version of that. DORA is out of Europe, and the R is for resilience, and that's a big thing these days, starting to recognize that organizations have to deal with a whole pile of hazards, not just cyber, and that it's about not being on or off like we see around disaster recovery or business continuity, but being able to maintain a certain level of service under duress. And the third-party risk management parts of all these are the ones that are getting the most amount of attention and are blowing up the fastest. Blowing up in a good way, right? They're expanding dramatically in all these efforts, right? So to Jeffrey's point, this is not easy stuff, and it's not one point in time, but like anything else, it's like eating the elephant, right? Same way you eat a hamburger, one bite at a time.
Right. So there are a couple of questions that just came in that I'll just kind of touch on real quick. So the first one, how do you stay updated on emerging threats and best practices? So that's a long answer. What I will do is I will work with the Sprinto team to actually compile a list of resources. Alex, I would ask if you could do the same, that would be great. And I think we can share that out. Second question is talking about digital threats. How do we identify emerging threats? So here's what I'm going to say. This is not a threat problem. This is a risk problem. There are impacts that we need to focus on and then work backwards. You will never, ever, ever get a hold of it if you take a threat-based approach. You have to look at the business impact. And I will tell you, businesses care broadly about three things: money coming in, money going out, and if something bad happens, who gets in trouble? Work backwards from there, and then you can identify which threats are important. And I'm not saying don't do threat intel, because that's valuable. But when we're talking about managing risk, you want to focus on those risks. And then finally, why do I think SMBs have been the focus of cyber attacks? So I will go back to a famous bank robber named Willie Sutton. And they asked him, why do you rob banks? And he said, because that's where the money is. These bad attackers, they don't want to work any harder than they have to. SMBs have less money, they have less resources, they have less tooling, they have less capabilities, they have less people to solve these problems. So that's easy. And then to Alex's point, if I can get into an SMB partner of a big company, I'm in the back door. So I think those are things there. Okay. All right. In the interest of time, Archie, I think we're going to skip a couple slides. So let me see the next one. I may have you skip a couple times. Okay. So actually 2 more clicks here and I'll, or maybe one more. I forget which version I have in here. So one of the things that Alex alluded to and that we talk to people about all the time is how do you assess the risk exposure in your end parties? And here's a list of different ways, and you can see the value and the cost and the effort. Now, a lot of these are high value, but they're very, very high cost. They're very, very high investment. What we see is this third-party risk intelligence, which in the interest of honesty is where Black Kite plays, but it's real-time. It's not perfect data, but it's updated on a regular basis, and it gives you the ability to see changes in your environment as opposed to a questionnaire that was filled out 18 months ago by people who are no longer employed by you. We suggest that people look at all of these, and when you prioritize your third parties, you can decide which you want to apply where. Next slide, please. Oh, one more. Sorry, there's the animation I was looking for. One more. Okay, so attack surface management is something Alex, he didn't use the term, but he alluded to it. This is what people think their attack surface is, right? It's your servers, your domains. Next slide, please. This is actually what your attack surface looks like. This is what we're facing, right? Now, to be fair, this is my attack surface at Black Kite. We have so many companies in here because we monitor everybody. But even for organizations that are not that big, you know, my wife runs her own business out of our kitchen. She's got 65 vendors. She's a one-person show. Most companies are relying on thousands, if not tens of thousands of partners. And you at least need to have some visibility into what these folks are doing, because they may not connect to you directly, but they may connect to you third, fourth, fifth things down. And if they fail, you get this cascading failure. You also have the problem of concentration risk, which is how many times does Google show up in there? Hundreds probably. And if they have an outage, or AT&T Mobile as an example, not to pick on them, right? So part of the reason why we think people struggle with how many partners is because they're looking at IT vendors, and there's physical vendors, and Alex talked about Target, and we see a lot of these breaches coming in from food service companies, coming in from physical vendors. So these are the things that you need to look at. One more slide, please. So how can you scale? How can you build this? So again, we have these 5 phases. One more click, please. Sorry, I know I'm going fast. We only have a few minutes left. All right, 2 more clicks here. So I always talk about the concept of data versus information versus intelligence. Data is raw, ones and zeros. Information is what you do when you apply a business context, and intelligence is when you add the what's your reaction on top of that. If you have intelligence about what is going on, next slide, you can make better and more defensible decisions. You're never going to get rid of all of your risk, but at least you need to raise awareness of your business stakeholders. What risks do we have, and what, if anything, can we do about them? Sometimes all we can do is be aware of it and build manual backup processes. Next slide, please. So treatment is a huge issue. I won't spend too much time on it, but treating is how do you engage with your partners when they don't do things you need them to do? Hey, we need you to put MFA, and we need you to do a better job of patching. You need to encrypt your data. You need to terminate these endpoints, etc. Next slide, please. So here's just a sort of a roadmap that we actually had out of our platform. Next slide, please. And now really we're going to get to monitoring, and this is what closes the loop. And we're going to share the slides, so I'm not going to go into detail, but monitoring is as close to real time, continuous monitoring. You want to see changes in your environment. You want to see, oh, look at that. A new software vulnerability just popped up, and it's in 500 of our partners. Oh, look at that. Russia just invaded Ukraine. we have operations in Ukraine and Russia. We need to know about that, right? So it's technical things, it's geopolitical, it's cultural, it might be environmental, right? If there's an earthquake or a flood or a hurricane, we need to know about that because it may have operational impact. Now, from a monitoring perspective, a lot of people think questionnaires, pen testing, risk assessments, doing SOCs, and Alex mentioned a SOC 2, which is very valuable, point-in-time snapshot. We need to figure out how we can get this to more real time, so we're actually doing continuous monitoring, or at least as close as we can get it. Next slide, please. Actually, you know what? Let's just skip through to the end, because really what I have are snapshots from our platform in here. We'll share all those slides with you. So we have like 2 minutes left. I don't think any other questions came in. But again, feel free to connect to me on LinkedIn, connect to Alex. Alex and I have actually been chatting kind of running up to this. We are happy to answer any questions you have. I am very anti-gatekeeping. I think we need to share everything we know, because the bad guys, they're all working together and we are not. So thank you.
I think we have, thank you so much, Jeffrey and Alex. We have one more question before we wrap. I've just posted it up, like it's now shared. Reducing TP risk. What can you do if you're a third party and you want to prove to your partner that you have reduced your risk? Positioning yourself better than the other third party vendors.
So Alex, you want to take this, and then I'll add anything that I see on top of what you say.
It's funny that I was going to offer it to you, but sure, why not? So when you're dealing with when you're dealing with third parties, the thing is, the other organization, since they, your customer, whoever you're trying to prove to, is looking for some level of assurance, and the tools that they're used to, like pen testing and vulnerability scans and all, they're just not available, especially as you're dealing with larger organizations. So the best way, or the most direct way to handle that, is to get a third-party attestation, with a SOC 2 Type 2 being the best one that's out there. And the reason you want a Type 2 is because it not only looks at the business, but it looks at the operational effectiveness of the controls that have been put in place. So it gives the highest level of assurance, and it's done by a specially trained objective third party to provide this level of assurance. So if there's one thing I would do, that would be it.
Okay. No, that's
Jeffrey,
great. And I agree with you. Yeah, I agree with you, Alex, 100%. The challenge, though, of course, is those are point-in-time snapshots, and a lot of small third parties can't afford to get those things done. There's a lot of work there. I would suggest setting aside tooling, because I don't want to make this a commercial, but I think that looking at opportunities to get closer to real time, to understand what the threat environment looks like, to understand what the risk environment looks like, look at the new open vulnerabilities, look at all of the attacks that are going on out there, and making sure that you are continually engaging, especially with your critical partners, even if it's just a monthly call to say, hey, we've seen these new vulnerabilities. What's going on? What are you doing there? I think the better the engagement, the more interactive it is, I think the better you can be. And then if you're a third party, even if you have someone come in and do an assessment, and we always suggest using standards-based approaches, using NIST CSF, using MITRE ATT&CK, using the new KEV stuff that's out of CISA in the US, looking at standard frameworks. ISO is another one, as opposed to publishing a report that says we're secure because I got 2 thumbs and I say so. So using those standards approaches for how do you benchmark, and then selecting a small set of controls that are very critical, like MFA, Alex mentioned earlier, data encryption, patching, strong identity and access management, making sure that you're focusing on those big ticket things that we know if you don't do them well, you're going to be victimized.
Okay, I think we have one more question. Bryant, I hope that answered your question, but if not, you can reach out to both Alex and Jeffrey. We have shared their LinkedIn and on the chat. How would you address shadow IT and third-party risk in a pharma setting? Alex, I saw that you were typing the answer. Like, do you want to take this?
Yeah, for some reason my answer disappeared. So a couple of things. That's weird. More often than not, people don't know that they're doing something bad when they procure some IT. They just think they're doing the right thing for the business. So a lot of it comes down to awareness and training. That'll eliminate a big chunk of it, or at least the kind of benign folks, right? There's others that are going to move out and do it anyhow. More often than not, they're detected for one of two reasons. Primarily because somebody gets an invoice, right? Like procurement or the CIO. It's classic that the CIO gets a bill for a cloud service that they never ordered, right? So one thing to do is to work with your procurement folks and your finance folks, because they'll become alerted, because there's definitely a paper trail, follow the money. The second one is because something goes wrong with it, and suddenly they call into the help desk looking for support on this thing you never knew you had. So engaging the help desk folks to understand, to look for this, helps a lot. And my general rule is they call in for the first time, hey, we didn't know you had this against corporate policy, blah, 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 blah. You need to speak to so-and-so to get on track, but we'll support you for now. You might support them 2 times, but I would never support them a third. Right. So,
right.
Carrots and sticks.
To build on that, Alex, you said a very important word, policy. What's your policy? If you have a policy and you're getting 100 exceptions a week, your policy's bad, because people need to do their jobs. So creating policy that is risk-based and not just a set of rules, do this. I always used to ask questions from the stage, how many of you have a password policy? And everybody puts their hands up. I say, well, how many of you explain why you have a password policies? And 2/3 of the hands go down. We know, because this is what we do. But the average user just thinks we're getting in their way, and they will look for every opportunity to bypass us because we're annoying, we're hurdles, we are Dr. No, and we need to move away from that approach and focus on business goals, business impacts, and make sure that our policy helps support that. So we don't say no when somebody says, hey, I want to go do this, but we do need to protect the organization. Like generative AI is a great example. I've seen too many instances of people uploading financial documents for analysis into OpenAI. And I go, yeah, that's a terrible idea, and you need to not do that, right? So some of that's about education.
Okay, I hope that answered your questions. With this, we are at the end of the session. Thank you so much, Alex and Jeffrey, for your time. And I hope, and thank you for all for tuning in on this session on Livestorm, on YouTube, on LinkedIn. We will be sharing the decks to everyone. In case you want to reach out to either Jeffrey or Alex, we have their LinkedIn up on the chats. And if you want to come back and watch this again, you just use the same link that's up. That will be up for rewatch as soon as I end this session. With this, take care, everyone. I hope you learned a lot and you found this session useful. And I'll see you in the next session.